Most people think family collapses begin with one giant moment. One scream, one arrest, one betrayal nobody can come back from. But according to Eric Carroll, the Whittaker family crisis began with something so small most people would have ignored it completely. A gas can sitting outside a house in rural West Virginia. That is what makes this story so unsettling. Because sometimes the smallest object becomes the thread that unravels everything behind it. Eric says the call came from Patrick. Patrick had just returned from the hospital after breaking his leg. He was hurt, frustrated, already dealing with pain, and trying to settle back into normal life when he checked footage from cameras around his property. And according to Eric, what Patrick saw immediately bothered him. Larry Whittaker had come onto the property late at night and taken a full gas can. At first glance, it sounds almost meaningless compared to everything that would later happen around the Whittaker family. One man takes gas. Another man gets angry. A family argument follows. In another household, maybe that would have been the end of it. But Eric says the moment carried a different feeling entirely. Because by this point, he had spent time around Larry. He had watched the family dynamics. He had listened to conversations. He had started building his own impression of the people inside the house. And according to Eric, Larry did not initially seem like someone who would sneak onto another person's property at night to steal. That contradiction stayed with him. Patrick was angry. Eric says Patrick had every right to be angry. Someone entered his property while he was recovering from a broken leg and took something that was not theirs. But Eric says the bigger issue was not the theft itself. It was what happened once Patrick confronted Larry about it. According to Eric, Patrick called Larry while Eric listened through FaceTime. Patrick asked him directly about the gas. No complicated setup, no long argument, just the question. And Eric says Larry admitted it. But then the conversation shifted. Because according to Eric's account, Larry claimed he had not wanted to do it. He allegedly said BJ pressured him into taking the gas. And Eric says Larry explained that pressure in deeply disturbing terms. According to Eric, Larry claimed BJ threatened to contact law enforcement and accuse him of something serious if he refused to help her. That allegation changes the emotional atmosphere of the entire story. And it needs to be treated carefully because this is not a proven court finding. It is Eric Carroll recounting what he says Larry Whittaker told them during that conversation. But in Eric's version of events, this became the moment where the situation stopped feeling like ordinary family dysfunction and started feeling dangerous. Not internet dangerous. Household dangerous. Because according to Eric, what he heard in Larry's voice was fear. Not anger. Fear. And fear changes how people understand behavior. Suddenly the gas can was no longer just theft. It became evidence, at least in Eric's mind, that pressure inside the Whittaker household had reached a level outsiders did not fully understand yet. Then Eric began describing another issue that may sound ordinary to most viewers but, according to him, carried enormous importance inside that house. The phone. Most people never think about how dependent they are on communication until communication disappears. In cities, people assume someone can always call for help. Someone has service. Someone can text. Someone can reach emergency responders quickly. But according to Eric, the Whittaker property in Odd, West Virginia operated differently. Cell service was unreliable, sometimes non-existent. The family depended heavily on a single house phone. And Eric says that house phone was not simply convenience. It was survival infrastructure. Because several members of the Whittaker family had severe medical issues already hanging over them. Heart attacks, heart conditions, relatives who had died from cardiac problems, elderly adults living hours from advanced medical care. In a situation like that, the ability to call for help becomes everything. Then Eric made another allegation. According to him, BJ sometimes removed the house phone from the home and locked it away inside a camper on the property whenever conflict escalated or she became angry. Again, this is Eric's account. But in his telling, that was the moment his emotional understanding of the situation changed permanently. Because now the issue was not simply family tension. It was vulnerability. If elderly people with serious health problems cannot access emergency communication, the entire household becomes exposed to risk. And according to Eric, once he heard that, he no longer viewed the situation as something he could ignore from another state. So he called his wife. He explained what he believed was happening. Then he got into his vehicle early the next morning and drove from Georgia to West Virginia. That drive becomes symbolic in Eric's version of the story because he repeatedly emphasizes how fast everything escalated emotionally after the Gaskin incident. According to him, he left around 6 in the morning. He barely stopped. One gas station. No real food. Hours on the road while trying to process what he believed he was driving into. And when he arrived, he says the focus immediately became legal protection. The first attempt involved Larry. Eric took him to the courthouse in Beckley to try securing a protective order. But according to Eric, the hearing went badly almost immediately. Larry, who had sounded emotional and urgent on the phone, became hesitant in person. His story lost force. The judge denied the request. And that denial frustrated Eric deeply because by this stage he believed the household was under genuine pressure. He thought he was responding to an emergency situation. Yet the legal system was treating the claims as insufficient. When they returned to the house, Betty was waiting. That detail matters because Eric describes the emotional atmosphere almost like a pressure chamber. Everyone inside the home seemed tense. Everyone seemed uncertain about who could say what openly. According to Eric, Betty immediately wanted to know whether the order had been granted. It had not. And Eric says something changed in her face after hearing that answer. He describes her looking back and forth between himself and Larry almost like someone deciding whether it was finally safe to speak honestly. Then, according to Eric, Betty began opening up. She allegedly admitted she wanted BJ removed from the property. More importantly, Eric says Betty began describing deeper concerns involving vulnerable family members who could not easily advocate for themselves. That becomes one of the emotional centers of Eric's entire story. Because when people can speak clearly, they can defend themselves. They can report abuse. They can explain danger. But when someone struggles to communicate, the burden falls onto everyone around them. And according to Eric, that realization made him angry. Not performative internet outrage. Protective anger. The kind that comes from believing vulnerable people may be trapped inside circumstances they cannot fully explain themselves. So Eric asked Betty whether she wanted to seek a protective order personally. She said yes. The next day, they returned to court. And according to Eric, the second attempt failed too. This part frustrated him even more because now Betty herself was speaking directly. Yet the judge reportedly explained that some allegations fell outside the immediate time frame necessary for emergency action. Again, denial. Again, no order. Again, the feeling that the legal system was moving slower than the emotional urgency inside the household. On the drive home, Eric asked Betty whether they could stop and speak directly with law enforcement. She agreed. And according to Eric, that conversation changed everything. According to Eric Carroll, the meeting with law enforcement was the moment the Whittaker situation stopped feeling temporary. Up until then, part of him still believed he might help stabilize things quickly, return to Georgia, and step back into normal life. But after speaking with the deputy, he says he realized this was becoming something much larger than a single family argument or one emergency court filing. Because the deputy already knew the family. That detail stayed with Eric. The Whittakers were not invisible to local authorities. People in the area already understood there were tensions around the property, vulnerable adults inside the home, instability involving extended relatives, and repeated conflict tied to the same names. According to Eric, The deputy listened carefully to Betty, reviewed what had happened, and then said something that gave them another chance. Come back tomorrow. A different judge would be presiding. That meant one more opportunity to secure legal protection. And by this point, Eric says the emotional atmosphere inside the Whittaker home had become exhausting. Not loud in the dramatic television sense. Not constant screaming or chaos every second. Something more subtle and harder to explain. A feeling that everyone inside the house was emotionally bracing for the next conflict before the previous one had even settled. That is one of the details outsiders often miss about fragile family systems. People imagine crisis only as explosive moments. But long-term instability usually feels quieter than that. A household learning how to function around fear. People adapting themselves to tension instead of escaping it. Routines shaped by whoever causes the most emotional pressure. And according to Eric, that was the environment he believed the Whittakers were living inside by the time he arrived. The next morning they returned to court. This time Betty spoke again. And according to Eric, the outcome finally changed. The protective order was granted. That moment matters because it transformed private family conflict into formal legal action. Once the order existed on paper, the situation no longer belonged only to arguments inside the house. Now law enforcement could act on it. And according to Eric, the judge asked a direct question. Could BJ remain on the property without creating further problems? Or did she need to be removed? Betty reportedly answered clearly. She needed to go. That answer became one of the turning points in the Whittaker story because it forced the family into a line they could no longer quietly step back from. Before this moment, conflict could still remain inside the household. People could argue, deny things later, reconcile temporarily, and continue existing in the same unstable cycle. But once the protective order was granted, the state itself became involved in separating people physically. According to Eric, law enforcement moved forward with removing BJ from the property. And interestingly, Eric says Betty did not want to witness it directly. That detail adds emotional complexity to everything that followed because it suggests something deeper than simple hatred or anger. Families shaped by addiction, dependency, poverty, and generational instability rarely divide cleanly into people who stop loving each other entirely. Often the emotional bonds survive even while the relationships themselves become destructive. That contradiction runs through the entire Whittaker story. People hurting each other while still emotionally tied to one another. People exhausted by someone's behavior while still unable to completely let go of them. Eric says they waited nearby at Patrick's property while the removal happened. From there, according to him, they saw BJ being escorted away from the Whittaker home. Then Eric drove Betty back. And this is where his language becomes almost symbolic. He says the house felt different afterward. Lighter, quieter, as if a dark cloud had temporarily lifted. Not healed, not fixed, but relieved. That description matters because it shows how strongly Eric believed the conflict surrounding BJ had affected the emotional environment of the household itself. According to him, multiple family members seemed calmer once she was gone. The tension eased. The atmosphere changed. But then Eric adds one detail that complicates the entire situation again. Larry was not happy. That contradiction becomes one of the most revealing moments in Eric's story because it destroys any simplistic interpretation. If Larry truly feared BJ, if he truly admitted being pressured, if he truly helped secure the protective order, why would he seem unhappy after her removal? Eric never fully resolves that contradiction. Instead, he leaves it hanging. And maybe that is honest because real family systems often contain contradictions outsiders cannot fully untangle. Fear and attachment can coexist. Relief and guilt can coexist. People can desperately want someone gone while simultaneously grieving their absence once they leave. especially in isolated family structures where relationships become emotionally entangled over decades. According to Eric, that is what made the Whittaker household so difficult to understand from the outside. Nothing existed in clean categories. Loyalty shifted constantly. Fear mixed with dependence. Conflict mixed with care. And hanging over all of it were the most vulnerable family members. Timmy, Lorraine, Ray, people who depended heavily on the emotional stability of the household around them. That dependency is central to understanding why the situation escalated institutionally afterward. Because once law enforcement became involved, new questions emerged automatically. Who exactly was caring for the vulnerable adults inside the home? Was the environment stable? Were they safe? Were medical needs being met consistently? Who was controlling access to the property? Who was influencing decisions? And perhaps most importantly, could the family structure continue functioning without outside intervention? Eric says he originally believed the protective order might calm everything down. Instead, it opened another door entirely. Adult Protective Services. According to Eric, APS contacted him not long after the court proceedings. He says they were already aware of the family and had been monitoring aspects of the situation. In his telling, the protective order itself intensified institutional attention because it formally documented instability surrounding vulnerable adults. That matters because once legal systems begin recognizing patterns of risk around disabled or elderly individuals, agencies are often required to investigate further. And according to Eric, APS did not approach the situation casually. He described meetings, questions, conversations about the living conditions, discussions about identification documents, benefits, medical care, bathing assistance, transportation, supervision, and long-term support. The language shifted away from internet narratives entirely. Now the focus became care structures, institutional language replacing emotional family language. And this is where Eric's account becomes emotionally complicated again because he insists he did not initially expect to become deeply involved in these conversations. He portrays himself as someone responding to escalating problems step by step rather than entering West Virginia with a master plan. Whether viewers believe that or not, it is clearly how he frames his own role. He says he was suddenly discussing guardianship paperwork, conservatorship possibilities, legal responsibilities tied to vulnerable adults. And according to Eric, that frightened him because these were not symbolic conversations anymore. These were decisions capable of permanently reshaping the Whittaker family structure. Then Eric makes one of the most important arguments in his entire defense. He says people online later accused him of wanting control over the family. But according to him, the APS conversations actually prove the opposite. Because he says if power or control had truly been his hidden goal, this was the exact moment he could have aggressively pursued it. Instead, he says he hesitated. He thought about Betty, about her age, about how long she had cared for the family, about his own wife and children waiting back in Georgia, about the enormous responsibility attached to becoming legally responsible for vulnerable adults. And according to Eric, he realized the Whittaker story had evolved far beyond YouTube, content creation, or internet attention. Now the question was something heavier. Who could actually protect these people long-term? That is the question sitting underneath every chapter of the Whittaker story. Not simply who filmed them, not simply who earned money, not simply who lied, but who, if anyone, was truly equipped to keep vulnerable adults safe inside a collapsing family system already overwhelmed by poverty, isolation, aging caregivers, addiction, and public exposure. And according to Eric, once APS entered the picture, there was no returning to the old version of the story anymore. Once Adult Protective Services became deeply involved, Eric says the emotional center of the Whittaker story shifted completely. Before that point, Most people online were still treating the situation like internet drama. Content creators arguing with each other, rumors spreading, donation questions, videos, live streams, reaction channels dissecting every clip frame by frame. But according to Eric, APS did not care about online factions. They cared about vulnerability. That distinction matters because when institutions evaluate situations involving disabled or elderly adults, the conversation changes immediately. The questions stop being about popularity, loyalty, or audience opinion. Instead, they become procedural. Who is bathing these individuals? Who manages medication? Who controls money? Who provides transportation? Who documents medical care? What happens during emergencies? Who is legally accountable if neglect occurs? And according to Eric, those were the kinds of conversations suddenly happening behind the scenes. That is why he says the situation became emotionally overwhelming. Because by now, the family was no longer simply a struggling household hidden in rural West Virginia. They had become publicly exposed, vulnerable adults living under increasing institutional scrutiny. Every instability inside the home now carried consequences larger than private family conflict. And the deeper Eric became involved, the more he says he realized how fragile the entire structure truly was. Timmy depended heavily on routine. Lorraine was elderly and medically vulnerable. Ray struggled with communication and required ongoing supervision. Betty was aging herself. Larry appeared emotionally overwhelmed. And laid over all of it were years of poverty, isolation, and accumulated exhaustion. That is what Eric says people online often fail to understand. The Whittaker household was not built to survive the pressure of national internet attention. It barely survived ordinary life as it already existed. Then suddenly cameras, money, strangers, accusations, and public judgment enter the system all at once. And according to Eric, once that happened, the family structure began cracking under pressure from every direction. Some people wanted to help. Some wanted content. Some wanted influence. Some wanted money. Some genuinely cared but still unintentionally destabilized things further simply by becoming involved. And perhaps the hardest truth Eric tried to communicate was this. Not everyone who caused harm believed they were causing harm. That idea makes people uncomfortable because audiences prefer clear villains. But fragile family systems often deteriorate through confusion and weak boundaries more than deliberate evil. People convince themselves they are helping while unintentionally increasing chaos around already vulnerable individuals. According to Eric, that is part of what happened here. And eventually the state stepped in. The removals changed everything emotionally. Because once Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray left the property, the internet suddenly lost direct access to the people who had become the emotional center of the entire story. No more porch videos. No more casual clips. No more public updates showing their daily routines. Silence replaced visibility. And according to Eric, that silence created another dangerous vacuum online. People immediately began filling it with assumptions. Some assumed the removals proved the family had been monstrously abusive. Others assumed the state had overreached. Others blamed specific creators. Others blamed poverty itself. But Eric says the reality was more painful and more complicated than any single explanation. He describes the removals almost like a psychological fracture inside the remaining household. Betty devastated, Larry emotionally collapsing inward, the home itself feeling emptier in a way cameras could not fully capture. Because regardless of institutional necessity, separation still hurts. That is one of the moral tensions sitting at the center of the Whittaker story. A household can be unsafe and emotionally bonded at the same time. Intervention can be necessary and heartbreaking simultaneously. And according to Eric, outsiders often struggle to hold both truths together. Then came another shift. The internet started focusing heavily on blame. Who caused this? Who exposed the family? Who escalated things? Who benefited? Who failed them? And Eric says his own name became trapped inside those questions while he remained largely silent publicly. That silence allowed narratives to harden around him. Some viewers concluded he manipulated vulnerable people for content. Others insisted he was unfairly blamed for trying to help. And according to Eric, neither side fully understood the emotional reality of what had happened behind closed doors. Because in his telling, by the end of the process, nobody truly won. Not the family, not the creators, not the viewers emotionally invested in them. The household fractured. The vulnerable adults disappeared into state care. Public trust collapsed. Investigations emerged. And the family itself became permanently changed by exposure. That is why Eric repeatedly describes the Whittaker story as something much larger than internet entertainment. To him, it became an example of what happens when vulnerable people become public before stable systems exist around them. The internet moves faster than protection, faster than oversight, faster than ethics. Millions of viewers arrive emotionally before institutions fully understand what is happening. And once public attention transforms struggling families into symbols, it becomes almost impossible to separate genuine care from spectacle completely. That may be the deepest tragedy in the entire Whittaker story. Because many people probably did care. And many people probably also benefited. Those two truths are not mutually exclusive. That is what makes the story so morally unsettling. Eric Carroll says Larry and BJ changed the Whittaker family forever. Not simply because of one gas can, but because the chain reaction surrounding that moment forced everything hidden inside the household into public view. The fear, the pressure, the dependency, the instability, the vulnerability, the exhaustion. And once those forces collided with courts, law enforcement, APS, cameras, and internet attention, the Whittaker family stopped belonging only to themselves. Their story became public property. And according to Eric, that transformation changed every life connected to the house in ways nobody fully expected. If you have thoughts about the Whittaker family story, the role of internet exposure, or the difficult line between helping and exploiting vulnerable people, leave your perspective in the comments below. What makes Eric Carroll's version of the Whittaker story so difficult to process is that almost every person involved seems to believe they were reacting to danger while simultaneously becoming part of the chaos themselves. That is why this story still refuses to settle into one clean narrative even years later. Patrick sees a gas can disappear and believes something dishonest happened. Eric hears Larry's explanation and believes the household may be under pressure and fear. Betty reportedly feels overwhelmed and trapped between family loyalty and instability inside the home. Law enforcement sees enough concern to encourage another court attempt. Adult Protective Services sees enough vulnerability to become deeply involved. And somewhere inside all of that are Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray. Three people who depended almost entirely on the emotional and physical stability of the people around them. That is the part the internet often forgets. The Whittaker story became famous because viewers saw something shocking and unusual. But behind the viral clips was always a harder reality. Vulnerable adults living inside a fragile support system that may have already been close to collapse long before cameras arrived. Eric says the gas can incident exposed that collapse. Not because gas itself mattered so much, but because it allegedly revealed pressure inside the family that outsiders had not fully understood yet. According to his account, one small theft led to conversations about fear, manipulation, medical vulnerability, communication problems, court intervention, protective orders, and eventually state involvement. That is how fragile systems fail. Not always through one catastrophic event, but through layers of pressure finally becoming impossible to hide. And maybe the saddest part of all this is how quickly the internet transformed every stage of that collapse into spectacle. One side treated the Whittakers as helpless victims. Another treated them like manipulative scammers. Others focused entirely on the creators surrounding them. But almost nobody could fully separate emotion from certainty. People chose villains early. People chose heroes early. And once they did, every new detail simply became evidence supporting whatever conclusion they already wanted to believe. But real life rarely organizes itself that neatly. Eric Carroll insists he was trying to help. Other people remain deeply suspicious of his role. Both things can exist in tension until more facts emerge. That is why this story remains emotionally unresolved. Because underneath the arguments is a deeper question nobody has fully answered yet. What happens when vulnerable people become internet famous before stable protection exists around them? The Whittakers were not celebrities prepared for public life. They were a struggling rural family already carrying decades of poverty, disability, isolation, grief, and emotional dependence. Then suddenly millions of strangers arrived with cameras, opinions, donations, accusations, expectations, and endless judgment. No fragile household survives that unchanged. And according to Eric, once APS entered the story, there was no way back to the old version of the family anymore. The removals permanently altered the structure of the home. Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray disappeared from public life. Betty and Larry were left behind in a quieter house, carrying the emotional aftermath of everything that unfolded. That silence now hangs over the entire story. A silence filled by rumors, speculation, court discussions, investigations, and competing versions of the truth. But maybe the most honest conclusion is this. The Whittaker story was never just about one gas can. It was about what the gas can revealed. A vulnerable family already under strain. A household struggling to hold itself together. Outsiders entering with both good intentions and questionable motives. And a system that finally stepped in only after the situation had already become public spectacle. Eric Carroll says Larry and BJ changed the Whittaker family forever. Maybe they did. But maybe the internet changed them forever too. If you have thoughts on the Whittaker family story, the role of online exposure, or how vulnerable families should be protected once public attention arrives, leave your perspective in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.